the next chapter of the problem of slavery in the Age of Revolution. This should be chapter 5. It is a shorter chapter than the last one, so I'm going to try to do it all in one go instead of breaking it up like I did the last one. But that means I will have to definitely take a break in the middle and go get some more water because it's not that much shorter. Excuse me. All right, well, let's jump on into it, shall we? So, Chapter 5, The Quaker Ethic and the Anti-Slavery International. The Quaker Initiative. The Quakers, more than any other religious group, had long expressed misgivings over the possible sinfulness of buying and selling men. During the first half of the 18th century, however, they had been content to issue cautionary warnings about the African slave trade. To exhort Quaker masters to treat their black servants with Christian charity, and to ignore or disown the few deviants like Benjamin Lay, who shrilly proclaimed that, quote unquote, all slave keepers were apostates. The Quaker commitment to bear collective testimony against slavery came surprisingly late and coincided with the publication of secular anti-slavery arguments from jurists, philosophers, moralists, and men of letters. Quaker writers did not play a conspicuous part in creating their international body of anti-slavery literature, although Anthony Benezet helped to anthologize and disseminate it. Indeed, it was the emergence of an enlightened climate of opinion defining liberty as a natural and fundamental right that brought outside sanction to Quaker reformers like Benezet and John Woolman. But then climates of opinion do not give virgin birth to social movements. By the 1780s, the British and American Quakers could provide what no other group seemed capable of: decision, commitment, and most important, organization. It would be difficult to exaggerate the central role Quakers played in initiating and sustaining the first anti-slavery movements. During the 7 Years' War, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting moved from the ideal of Christianizing the master-slave relationship to the ideal of preparing slaves for freedom. By 1758, official committees were visiting and prodding individual slave owners, although a shortage of white servants occasioned by the war put a premium on the value of slaves. In 1760, New England Yearly Meeting ruled that the importers of slaves would be subject to discipline. The following year, London Yearly Meeting, under some pressure from Philadelphia, took the decisive move of authorizing disownment for Quakers still engaged in the slave trade. I'm assuming disownment is kind of like being excommunicated. I don't know for certain, but that's from context what I would gather it means. In 1774, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting finally adopted rules that threatened disownment for any buying or transfer of slave property, that barred Quakers from serving as executors of estates involving slaves, and that required masters to treat Negroes like other servants and to manumit them at the earliest opportunity. These efforts at self-reform, especially in Pennsylvania and Delaware, soon involved the Quakers in legal battles to protect slaves who claimed to be free. For example, Israel Pemberton and Thomas Harrison tried to defend an Indian woman and her children who had been brought from Virginia to Philadelphia. Because Harrison had given the family shelter, the court forced him to pay heavy damages, for which he was later reimbursed £25 in Anthony Benezet's will. It was this contest that led in 1775 to the formation of the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes. That wasn't the whole title, sorry. The Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. The Revolutionary War soon disrupted the organization, but early in 1784, The reported suicides of two blacks who had been illegally enslaved prompted the restoration of what was to become the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery, for the relief of free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage, and for improving the condition of the African race. I think that entire thing was the title of the organization. The phrase abolition of slavery reflected the new state law of 1780 providing for mandatory gradual emancipation. In New York, where no such law had yet been passed, the organization formed in January 1785 bore the title Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves in New York City. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society served as the model and inspiration for the various state societies which began in 1794 to send representatives to Philadelphia for the annual convention of delegates from the abolition societies. Prominent non-Quakers like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush served at one time or another as presidents of the Pennsylvania Society, but from the outset it was a predominantly Quaker organization. After selecting 68 of the Society's most active members during its first 25 years of existence, I have identified more than three-quarters as Friends. I have the Friends organization. I don't remember the full title of that organization. I have also identified as Quakers about one half of the most active members of the New York Manumission Society. In 1805, 7 of the 10 officers of the same society were Friends, except in Connecticut and Kentucky. Quakers were the chief organizers and most active supporters of the early American anti-slavery societies. In the North Carolina movement, the proportion of Quakers ran as high as 80%. For reasons I shall soon discuss, the American Revolution not only stimulated the anti-slavery zeal of American Quakers, but encouraged them to exert pressure on the British and American governments for the abolition of the slave trade. Even before the war had ended, Philadelphia meeting for sufferings, an executive committee concerned with political and legal defense urged its counterpart body in London to organize efforts against the African trade. As a result of this correspondence, Philadelphia and London Quakers succeeded in coordinating petitions in 1783 both to Parliament and to the Continental Congress. Partly in response to pressure from visiting American Quakers, London meetings for sufferings appointed in 1783 a special committee on the slave trade. Some of the members of this committee had already formed an unofficial committee of 6 to consider steps, quote, for the relief and liberation of the Negro slaves in the West Indies and for the discouragement of the slave trade on the coast of Africa, end quote. Excuse me. This small public relations committee soon began collecting and reprinting a wide range of anti-slavery literature, making arrangements especially to submit regular contributions to the London and provincial press. Between 1783 and 1787, there were thus 2 overlapping Quaker abolition committees in London. By 1785, the Slave Trade Committee of the Meetings for Sufferings had expanded its goals to include gradual emancipation and had pressed its parent body to request detailed information from Philadelphia on the good effects of slave manumission. It was the same committee which decided on February 26, 1787, that the time had arrived for a renewed application to Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade. Since the sequence of related events highlights the importance of Quaker initiative, I shall briefly summarize the chronology. In 1774, during his first trip from America to England, William Dillwyn had made the acquaintance of Granville Sharp and other non-Quakers with whom Anthony Benezet had corresponded on the subject of slavery. On April 25, 1783, after Dillwyn had returned to England, and several months before he helped organize the 2 Quaker committees, Sharp answered his requests for arguments and new evidence against the slave trade. The two men soon engaged in long conferences and continued to meet during the next few years. In 1784, James Phillips, the Quakers' official printer and a member of the Slave Trade Committee of the Meetings for Sufferings, published James Ramsay's An Essay on the Treatment and Conversion of African Slaves in the British West Indies. Ramsay, an Anglican clergyman who had spent many years in the West Indies, sent Phillips instructions on how to get copies of his book to the king and queen, and continued to suggest names of others who should receive anti-slavery literature. Meanwhile, Thomas Clarkson, who was eager to publish the essay on the slave trade, which had won him a prize at Cambridge in 1785, found his way to Phillips' shop, where he soon met Dillwyn and other Quaker activists. It was well before 1787, therefore, that the Quaker abolitionists had established cooperative ties with outsiders like Sharp, Ramsay, and Clarkson. On May 14, 1787, after frequent previous meetings, the Committee of the Meeting for Sufferings concluded that it was too late in the term to petition Parliament. But in determining to mount a campaign directed at the next session of Parliament, they had apparently decided to broaden the membership of the informal publicity group. For on May 19, Dillwyn recorded a meeting at James Phillips' shop of a committee on the slave trade now instituted, quote unquote. 2 nights later, Clarkson met William Wilberforce and other dignitaries at the famous anti-slave trade dinner at the home of Bennet Langton, a host who had moved in London's highest social circles. The next day, May 22nd, 12 men met at Phillips' shop and officially organized the society instituted in 1787 for effecting the abolition of the slave trade. Except for Sharp, Clarkson, and Philip Sampson, all were Quakers and all were veterans of the earlier Quaker abolitionist efforts. 5 were members of the informal publicity group, and at least 4 were on the Meeting for Suffering's Slave Trade Committee. Quakers always predominated as the most regular attendees and active workers of the nominally non-Quaker Abolition Committee, even after evangelicals had begun to take over political leadership of the movement. Moreover, Quakers played a leading role in organizing anti-slave trade societies in most of the provincial cities and towns. It was through Quaker example and Quaker encouragement that figures like Sharp and Clarkson became involved in abolitionist organization. It was the Society of Friends that the Parisian Amis de Noir sought to imitate. Although Quakers in general shared a similar heritage and subculture, they lived in very different environments that inevitably affected the outcome of their anti-slavery views. In the southern states, there were severe obstacles that delayed implementation of the sect's emerging policy of self-purification. In the South, even more than in England or in the North, the Quaker governing bodies were anxious to dissociate themselves from any official link with manumission societies or with the anti-slavery movement as a whole. In the Middle Atlantic states, however, some of the weightiest religious leaders were among the minority of reformers who wished to go beyond the society's official stand. Pennsylvania Friends were, of course, the heirs of William Penn's Holy Experiment. They could draw on traditions of leadership and power. It is true that the immigration of non-Quakers had slowly undermined their political dominance, and that the 7 Years' War had forced many conscientious Quakers to withdraw from the colonial legislature. The American Revolution, coming so soon after the war with France, reinforced popular suspicion that the pacifist Quakers were loyalist sympathizers, if not outright traitors. Yet, as Sidney V. James has perceptively shown, the Pennsylvania Quakers did not abandon their traditions of social leadership as a result of persecution and lessening political power. On the contrary, they took the lead in a variety of benevolent causes, including anti slavery, partly as a means of reasserting their influence, of vindicating their reputation, and of restoring cooperative ties with revolutionary patriots like Franklin and Rush. Social reform helped to give Quakers the sense of being, quote, a people among peoples, end quote, and thus a part of the sovereign people. Even when fearing and disapproving violence, American Quakers could appeal to the principles of natural rights or to the Declaration of Independence. When Quaker merchants called for an end to the slave trade, they were in effect supporting colonial grievances against British imperial policy. For their English brethren, the same move not only implied a challenge to an institution sanctioned by church and state, but had to be addressed to a traditional order that denied them political rights. There is evidence that anti slavery activity brought American Quakers into sharp conflict with rival ethnic groups, such as the Germans in Pennsylvania and the Dutch in New York. Yet it also served to rehabilitate former leaders like James Pemberton. Pemberton was a Quaker merchant who belonged to one of Philadelphia's wealthiest and most powerful families. He was also one of the Quakers who had resigned from the assembly during the 7 Years' War. After returning to the legislature during the brief interim of peace, Pemberton was arrested during the Revolution as a security risk and sent, along with 19 other friends, to Virginia for detention. After the war, however, Pemberton regained prestige as an anti slavery leader. He was one of the principal founders of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, over which he presided in place of the nominal chairman, Benjamin Franklin. He then succeeded Franklin as the Society's president, and was succeeded himself by the illustrious Rush. Unlike their brethren in Pennsylvania, English Quakers had always been outsiders. As dissenters, they were excluded from public office and from the universities. The professions were virtually closed to them, and they were barred by religious scruples from many other employments that could have been the source of influence and power. On the other hand, they had achieved a pragmatic accommodation with the British political order and were acutely sensitive to any public actions which might rekindle prejudice or jeopardize their informal mechanisms of influence. Thus, David Berkeley, whose wealthy and eminent family had entertained the king, sent an angry letter to James Pemberton in 1783 complaining of the impetuosity of the American quote unquote reformers who had recently arrived in England and who had agitated the slave trade question at London Yearly Meeting. The Americans had presumed to tell Berkeley that he should not quote William Penn because Penn, quote, had dealt or approved the dealing in slaves, end quote. Even worse, they had pressed the English Quakers to address the king, quote, to use his influence with his parliament to discountenance the trade, end quote. A move not only highly improper but self-defeating. Berkeley, who said he spoke for, quote, some of our most weighty, valuable friends, friends capitalized, um, told the American leader that he hoped friends will be wise enough to submit with propriety to the powers placed over them, or that such as do not approve thereof will leave the country. End quote. Berkeley had actually deflected the move to petition the king and had persuaded the London Yearly Meeting of the propriety of sending a delegation to Parliament, which was about to consider a measure prohibiting servants of the African Company from engaging in the slave trade, quote, to the detriment of their masters, end quote. As a result of Berkeley's strategy, Lord North and Lord John Cavendish courteously received the Quaker delegation. Sir Cecil Ray praised Quaker benevolence when he introduced in the Commons their petition to end the slave trade, and though Parliament tabled the proposal, since it went so far beyond the measure before them, The Quakers received favorable publicity in the public press. It was this occasion that prompted both London Yearly Meeting and Meeting for Sufferings to give official approval to a pamphlet drafted by William Dillwyn and John Lloyd, "The Case of Our Fellow Creatures, the Oppressed Africans, respectfully recommended to the serious consideration of the legislature of Great Britain by the people called Quakers." The Slave Trade Committee of the Meetings for Sufferings succeeded in getting copies to the King, the Queen, the Secretaries of State, and then to MPs. Following this achievement, the Slave Trade Committee printed more than 10,000 copies and devised an elaborate plan for personal distribution to virtually every institution, office holder, and influential man in the realm. By 1786, it was not accidental that the Quaker testimony was commonplace knowledge in Great Britain, or that a pamphlet by Benezet should be readily accessible to anyone who cared to read it. Hey, Vesper, how are you doing tonight? I'm doing pretty good. The availability of such channels and media of persuasion was only one of the circumstances that differentiated British and American Quakers. English Quakers had been mainly concerned with freeing their expanding commercial enterprises from any direct involvement with the slave trade, especially since so much Quaker capital had been invested in colonial commerce. London Yearly Meeting exhorted the various colonial meetings to clean themselves from the unrighteous practice of keeping bondsmen, but few English friends had any direct experience with slaveholding. Thus, when David Barclay discovered that he and his brother had acquired 32 Jamaican slaves as payment for a debt, he was ultimately forced to rely on the assistance of James Pemberton and the Philadelphia Quakers. His own Jamaican agent refused to emancipate the blacks in Jamaica because the example would be, quote, unpopular in the island, end quote. Barclay finally had to send another agent to Jamaica, who with some difficulty persuaded the blacks to embark with him to Philadelphia, where they were apprenticed under the supervision of the Abolition Society, after a committee had decided, quote unquote, what they are fit for. If the British Quakers were tuned to publicity campaigns and to the subtle means of reaching men of power, they were unfamiliar with the problems of committees appointed to, quote, free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage, or for improving the condition of free blacks, end quote. In the North, at least, American Quakers acquired their main knowledge of slavery through experience with domestic servitude and through their commercial activities in port cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. Understandably, their main anti-slavery interests focused on stopping the further importation of Negroes, on removing legal obstacles to private manumission, on preventing the re-enslavement of free blacks, and on providing education, apprenticeship, and old age assistance for the objects of their benevolence. Far more than their English brethren, the Americans understood the extent and depth of racial prejudice, as well as the painful complexities of converting domestic servants into free men. They tended to assume, however, that their English correspondents, being free of such obstacles and being closer to the centers of imperial power, could take the leadership in eradicating the Atlantic slave system. Despite the diversity of Quaker experience and the lack of a central ecclesiastical authority, the Society of Friends maintained unity by a communications network unparalleled in the 18th century. This achievement was partly the cause and partly the result of the incredible commercial success of enterprising Quakers. The network's growth had also been encouraged by persecution, which had led not only to transatlantic migration, but to institutions for communal discipline and mutual aid. Above all, the communications network drew strength from the Quaker ethic, which gave its adherents the confident sense of being members of an extended family whose business and personal affairs were united in a seamless sphere. The decisions of London Yearly Meeting radiated outward through an intricate structure of regional, yearly, quarterly, monthly, and local meetings, affecting the personal and economic lives of Friends from North Carolina to Ireland. A word about the nature and scope of the Quaker communication system reveals some of the social implications of the Quaker anti-slavery initiative. Although Friends relied heavily on informal correspondence and on official epistles between the various meetings, it was the traveling ministry that brought distant congregations into living fellowship. By gently rebuking the families they visited for retaining Negro slaves or for displaying worldly vanities, the itinerants also helped to define as well as to apply the consensual value of the society. Theoretically, any friend of either sex could feel called to a traveling mission and receive the assent of the appropriate meetings. In practice, however, traveling ministers won recognition only if they could serve as models of authentic religious purity, proving themselves acceptable, quote unquote, to the various congregations they visited. Though far lesser known than the Wesleys and Whitefields, they were a powerful arm of the international Great Awakening. The 18th century Quaker revival had two overlapping phases. Many of the early traveling ministers were imbued with a quietistic yearning for self-effacement. Often inclined toward mysticism, they developed spiritual exercises to cleanse themselves of every taint of worldliness. Both in England and America, the Quietists' appeal for absolute purity and selflessness struck the consciences of Friends who were dismayed by bloody Indian wars on the American frontier or by their own indirect complicity in the wars with France. John Churchman, for example, saw the Indian raids on the Pennsylvania frontier as a sign of divine disapproval for slaveholding. Churchman, a saintly American quietist, was the mentor and friend of John Woolman. At times, Churchman joined Woolman in visiting and expostulating with Quaker slaveholders, and in a sense, Woolman's continuing and lonely crusade against slavery was an objectification of the older minister's spiritual quest for purity. Excuse me. The second phase of Quaker revivalism came closer to the evangelicalism of the major Protestant denominations and coincided with Quaker efforts to enlist outsiders in various benevolent causes. Like Anglican and Methodist evangelicals, the younger Quakers stressed the sinfulness of natural man and the mercies of Christ the Redeemer. Among the leading Quaker preachers of this Christ centered faith was Rebecca Jones, a convert from Philadelphia's Anglican Church. A close friend of Benezet's, the Pembertons, and the Dillwins, Rebecca Jones achieved various triumphs on a mission to England, not the least of which was the conversion of young William Allen to a life of serious religion. Serious in quotes. Later on, in the early 19th century, Allen's serious interest in religion led him to work closely with British diplomats on the international suppression of the slave trade and to confer personally on that subject with Emperor Alexander I of Russia. Rebecca Jones's most noted co-worker was her fellow Philadelphian William Savery, who converted both Isaac Hopper and Elizabeth Gurney, later Fry, to serious religion, thereby channeling the former toward a life of abolitionism and the latter toward worldwide fame as a prison reformer. Savery even tried to bring off the coup of the century by laboring in France to persuade Thomas Paine, the great infidel himself, to return to his parental faith. The distinction between quietistic and evangelical ministers, however, is less important than the role both played as catalysts of anti-slavery commitment. It is true that the journals of the great itinerants are almost wholly preoccupied with religion. Yet there can be no question that virtually all the early Quaker anti-slavery leaders were profoundly influenced by the same traveling ministers. Woolman and Churchman, for example, were intimate with the Pemberton brothers, Israel, James, and John, whose family not only owned slaves but had amassed a fortune from the West India trade and from the sale in Europe of slave-produced sugar, rum, tobacco, and rice. Notwithstanding their worldly interests, the Pembertons became deeply moved by the spirit of the revival. Partly at the instigation of Samuel Fothergill, a visiting English minister, they threw their powerful support behind the Quaker withdrawal in 1756 from the Pennsylvania Assembly. They helped to create and manage Philadelphia Meeting for Sufferings, and while the Pembertons continued to draw wealth from the produce of West Indian slaves, they freed their own Negroes and became leaders in a variety of philanthropic activities. It was on a Pemberton ship that Woolman planned to sail to the West Indies in 1769 to preach against slavery. Meanwhile, in the early 1750s, John Churchman had persuaded young John Pemberton to give up business for a religious life. For 3 years, the two men traveled together through Britain and the continent, struggling against Quaker declensions in faith. John Pemberton's strictures against card playing and violations of the Sabbath anticipated the mood of evangelical Puritanism. He was so shocked by the visibility of English drunkards, whores, and profane swearers, quote unquote, that he thought divine punishment must be at hand. For ministers like Pemberton, involvement with slavery was simply one of the many worldly sins, and queries about slavery could be taken as a prime test of how clear Quakers were of contamination. When Woolman himself finally arrived in England 20 years later, he expressed astonishment that many Friends were still indirectly connected with the African trade, a fact he interpreted as the prime symbol of their worldliness and degeneracy. The mainspring of the Quaker revival lay in such transatlantic lines of influence and personal acquaintance. As the highest official in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia Meetings for Sufferings, John Pemberton could put considerable weight behind the coordination of anti-slavery activity. Through commercial as well as religious correspondence, he and his brother James were close to Quaker planters like Robert Pleasance and to Quaker merchants like Moses Brown, the leader of the anti-slavery cause in Rhode Island. Beginning in 1770, the Pembertons aided and spread news about Benezet's School for Negro Children. Even before the American Revolution ended, John Pemberton sailed again for England, where he joined his cousin William Dillwyn in urging London Meetings for Sufferings to take action against the slave trade. When Rebecca Jones arrived in London in 1784, she was delighted to encounter 6 American Quaker ministers, in addition to Pemberton, most of whom were actively engaged in the anti-slavery cause. The revival moved both ways across the Atlantic. In 1755, 2 years before Woolman's most famous mission through the South, Israel Pemberton and Samuel Fothergill had traveled the same route, quietly preaching against slavery. A leader of the revival in England, Fothergill also quickened the move for self-purification among Philadelphia Friends. Upon returning to England, he helped to indoctrinate future English abolitionists like George Harrison and the Gurneys of Norwich. It was Samuel's brother John, an internationally renowned physician, who welcomed John Woolman to England. A member of London Meetings for Sufferings, Dr. Fothergill moved in the highest circles of enlightened culture. He was a close friend of Benjamin Franklin and a licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians, though excluded as a Quaker from being a fellow. Dr. Fothergill's interests ranged from projects for prison reform to a plan for colonizing emancipated Negroes in Africa. a plan for which he said he would contribute £10,000. A correspondent of Benezet's, he also had a link through Joseph Priestley, whom he aided with money and apparatus, with the nonconformist radicals of the Birmingham Lunar Society. It is tempting, therefore, to see a stream of anti-slavery influence running from the Quaker revival through Fothergill to men like Priestley, Richard Price, Thomas Day, and Josiah Wedgwood, who laid the foundations for a more secular and radical abolitionism in Birmingham and Manchester. One can speak with more confidence about Fothergill's influence on young Quaker physicians like Thomas Knowles, Joseph Hooper, John Coakley Lettsome, and George Vaux, all of whom became involved in the British anti-slavery movement. Although Quaker physicians were few in number, since they could seek degrees only in Scotland or on the continent, they gave representation in the ranks of British abolitionists to a profession that seems generally to have been indifferent or hostile to reform. The traveling ministers prepared the way by exhorting influential friends to cast off worldly contaminations, which included ties with slavery. The transatlantic connections provided a framework for coordinated action. The deepening imperial crisis, however, precipitated the first Quaker efforts to shift from internal reform to a program for changing the course of history. In the years immediately following the Stamp Act crisis, American Quakers sought to use the leverage of their English connections as a means of modifying British imperial policy. There were mixed motives behind the colonial attempts to tax or prohibit the importation of slaves. But for American Quakers like Benezet and Robert Pleasants, the actions of the Virginia General Assembly, coupled with Arthur Lee's much quoted Address on Slavery, could be used to show that the colonial cause was not only sincere, but embodied the noblest principles of an enlightened age. The Americans exhorted the more influential British friends to use the slave trade issue as an instrument of reconciliation. In 1773, after considerable prodding from the Americans, David Barclay led a delegation to visit the Lord of Trade in futile support of Virginia's attempts to levy a prohibitive tax on imported Africans. By then, British friends recognized that a political breach with the colonies would pose grave threats to business as well as to religion. Between English and American Quakers, there was a subtle competition in registering anti-slavery influence. Writing soon after the Somerset decision had removed any legal basis for slavery in England, London Yearly Meeting rejoiced in the growing testimony against slavery in America, but expressed a rather paternalistic hope that the colonies would work harder at enacting laws that encouraged the institution. I'm sorry, I said encouraged. That was discouraged the institution. Sorry about that. In 1782, Philadelphia Meeting for Sufferings proudly cited Virginia's law allowing private manumissions as a sign that, quote, through the favor of divine providence, the light of truth hath evidently broken forth in many places amongst those whom temporal considerations and long accustomed prejudices have held in obdurate blindness, end quote. I'm not familiar with the term obdurate. Obdurate. Excuse me. Yet British authorities still supported the quote unquote crying enormity of the slave trade as well as the war against America. The Philadelphians hoped that, quote, divine wisdom will be afforded to qualify you as instruments in the hand of the Lord to the gradual extirpation, end quote, of the slave trade. Look up unfamiliar terms so we can learn. Yeah, I don't like to do that in the middle of reading, but maybe I should start. I lost my place. Sorry. Uh, Extirpation. Okay. In reply, London Meetings for Sufferings promised to put Philadelphia's request before the yearly meeting, but warned of the great opposition that could be expected from interested parties in the government. Philadelphia then responded, perhaps with intentional irony, that if the, quote, temper of humanity was gradually prevailing among British statesmen, as the London Quakers had claimed in a letter of 1773, then there should be grounds for hope notwithstanding the power of interested parties. With the end of hostilities, the Philadelphia Quakers actually shifted their major hopes to the personal influence of Americans like William Dillwyn and John Pemberton, who had arrived in England. As James Pemberton pointed out to his brother, John, the Americans were more familiar with slavery than were their English brethren. They could obviate the objections which timidity or ill-founded fears might suggest. Some of the English leaders were annoyed by the Americans' rashness and disregard for political proprieties, but through the 1780s the British and American Quakers continued to spur each other on, proudly reporting their anti-slavery gains on both sides of the Atlantic. For those IQ 145 words, I think it would be nice. Get a little dictionary. Yeah, I have an old dictionary somewhere here. Somewhere. Not a new one, obviously, but it's an old word, so it would be in the old dictionary anyway. Um, I'll have to find that, dig it out, and have it handy because I do occasionally. Oh, there it is. Boom, there it is. It's a small one with minuscule writing. But yeah, let's go ahead and look that up. Let's start that as a practice. Now, what was the word? Obdurate. Whoop, there it is. Yeah, even with my cheaters on, this is minuscule writing. Obdurate. Obtuse. We're getting close. Object. Obfuscate. Obese. Obdurate. Hardened against influence or feeling. Intractable. Okay, so in context, considerations and long accustomed prejudices have held in obdurate blindness. Hardened against influence or feeling. Okay. I'm not sure I understand even at that, but that's okay. Moving on. But now that I have it handy, it will stay handy. The solvent of wealth. Few accounts of early Quaker abolitionists give any indication of their most conspicuous characteristic, which was quite simply their incredible economic success, although it is generally acknowledged that Quakers epitomized the quote unquote Protestant ethic. The central role they played in 18th century commerce, banking, and industry is seldom appreciated. The feeling has become more cemented, is my guess. Yeah, that that makes sense. Cut off from traditional sources of wealth and power, the English friends searched for new opportunities in innocent trades, quote unquote innocent, to a variety of small scale enterprises ranging from pottery and china to iron production. They brought a seriousness of purpose, a discipline of mind, and a compelling commitment to useful work. They were naturally innovators fascinated by the possibility of useful improvements, their sectarian exclusiveness resulting in an intricate web of intermarriages, linked one successful enterprise with many others. By the second half of the 18th century, the English Quakers had established themselves as the founders and managers of great firms manufacturing porcelain, clocks, instruments, drugs, and china. They were leaders in mining, particularly of lead, and in the production of brass, zinc, copper, and other metals. According to Paul Manteau, the history of three generations of the great Quaker Derby dynasty, quote, sums up that of the whole English metalworking industry, end quote. Nor was it accidental that the names of two great Quaker families, the Lloyds and the Barclays, should ultimately come to designate two of the world's greatest banks. The very embodiment of the capitalist mentality, the English Quakers were in the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution. One gets more sense of the linkage of Quaker interests from the diaries of William Dillwyn, whom Thomas Clarkson praised as the chief organizer of the British anti-slavery movement. Born in Philadelphia in 1738, Dillwyn was a pupil of Anthony Benezet and then a merchant associated with the Pembertons. In 1773, he wrote his cousin James Pemberton from Charleston, reporting his success in exchanging West Indian rum for Carolina rice. In the same year, he published a cautious and anonymous pamphlet suggesting the expediency of gradual emancipation, and also joined a Quaker delegation petitioning the New Jersey Assembly for a more liberal law regulating slave manumissions. In 1774, Dillwyn sailed for England, carrying with him letters from Benezet to a variety of people, including Granville Sharp and John Wesley. Soon after arriving, Dillwyn called upon Sharp and John Wesley. I'm sorry, upon I jumped back up a line. Soon after arriving, Dillwyn called upon Sharp, Benjamin Franklin, the Fothergills, and Samuel Hoare. Hoare. Horry? I'm not sure. The latter, the wealthy Quaker merchant, had recently formed a banking firm that would eventually merge as a result of intermarriages with the Gurney and Barclay banking houses, forming the nucleus of Barclays Bank. Dillwyn went with John Gurney and George Harrison to drink tea at David Barclay's, where he also met Joseph Bevan and John and Ambrose Lloyd. John Gurney was the co-founder of the famous Gurney Bank at Norwich. Harrison was a barrister at law. Bevan was a leading drug manufacturer, and the Lloyds, who had family connections with the Pembertons, had already expanded from their Birmingham iron and metal trades into banking and industry. Samuel Darby of the great iron family took Dillwyn on a tour of the Liverpool docks. In the same city, he visited William Rathbone, a rich timber merchant and later a Quaker abolitionist. It was Manchester, however, that seems to have excited Dillwyn the most. In that quote-unquote thriving populous town, he inspected the warehouses filled with domestic manufacturers and spent hours marveling at the linens, cottons, velvets, fustians, hats, and threads. In Birmingham, he dined with Samson Lloyd, who had been called the true father of Lloyd's Bank, and then toured, quote, Taylor's famous belt manufacturers where abundance of women are employed, end quote. He described the pump machinery used to draw water from Quaker-owned lead mines, and in Dorset he viewed the curious silk mill for winding raw silk, in and about which what? I'm I think maybe this is supposed to be a quote. In and about which I was informed near 300 persons were constantly employed, but many of them are young children who watch the winding of the silk of the reels and twisting it. The machinery is admirable and consists of many thousand wheels of different sizes. Oh, I see. That was a okay. I didn't notice the font change. Sometimes he changes this font size just slightly and it becomes a quote, but it was at a page break, so I didn't notice it. So that was a quote. As Dillon continued to make notes on British industry and on his business meetings with leading entrepreneurs, he also grew increasingly gloomy over the news that, quote, a bad ministry is resolving to enslave my country, end quote. He attended meetings of merchants who were angered by British policy and by Parliament's refusal to heed their petitions. After a 17-month stay in England, Dillwyn received a certificate from London addressed to his own monthly meeting in West Jersey, attesting to his good conduct while abroad. When he departed for America in 1775, he was on intimate terms with the men who would launch a British anti-slavery movement. Joseph Woods, Thomas Knowles, John Lloyd, George Harrison, Samuel Hoare Jr., Joseph Gurney, Joseph Gurney Bevan, Philip Sampson, and Granville Sharp. He had also met the families that would found some of England's greatest industries, banks, railroads, and insurance companies. When Dillwyn returned to England for good in 1781, he called on Sharp to discuss the slave trade. Having married Sarah Weston, a wealthy heiress, he also joined the firm of Weston, James, and Dillwyn. He later bought the Cambrian Pottery Works at Swansea, which produced china of international fame. The family connections between Quaker business and reform were extraordinarily complex. One of the centers of early British anti-slavery activity was the home of Joseph Gurney Bevan at Plough Court, London. As apothecaries and chemists, the Bevans had built up a prosperous, not preposterous, a prosperous pharmaceutical concern at Plough Court through Dr. John Fothergill. They won the contract to supply Pennsylvania Hospital. By the 1780s, the firm had grown sufficiently. By the 1780s, the firm had grown sufficiently to allow Joseph Gurney Bevan the leisure to dabble at poetry, to write a refutation of the misrepresentations of Quakers, and to devote considerable time to the Quaker Slave Trade Committee and then to the London Abolition Society. When Rebecca Jones visited the Bevan family, she was welcomed by Bevan's close friend William Dillwyn, whom she found living elegantly, quote unquote. Bevan was also an intimate friend of the Quakers' official publisher and bookseller, James Phillips. On Lombard Street, close to David Barclay's house and to such Quaker banking firms as Hanbury, Taylor, Lloyd, and Bowman, Phillips printed the thousands of anti-slavery pamphlets authorized by the Quaker Committee and the later Abolition Society. The Bevans were related by marriage both to the Barclays and the Gurneys. Joseph Gurney Bevan was a cousin of Elizabeth Gurney Fry. His half-brother was a bank partner of the Barclays. His own production of drugs and chemicals soon led into the chemistry of brewing. In 1781, a Bevan and a Barclay bought the Anchor Brewery for £30,000 and, with help from members of the Gurney clan, converted it into a highly profitable enterprise. The brewery soon passed into the hands of Robert Barclay of Clapham, whose mother was a Gurney, and who was himself an active member of the Abolition Committee, along with his good friends John Lloyd and William Dillwyn. Thomas Fowle Buxton of the next generation led the parliamentary struggle against slavery in the 1820s. Although Buxton was not a friend himself, his mother belonged to the Quaker Hanbury family, which had founded a tobacco empire prior to the American Revolution and had then turned to banking, brewing, and iron before eventually launching the age of chocolate. Buxton's wife was the daughter of the banker John Gurney, and was thus the sister of both Elizabeth Fry and of the abolitionist Joseph John Gurney. When in 1808 Buxton joined the brewing firm of Truman, Hanbury and Company, he helped to consolidate, according to Arthur Raystrick, the Hanbury iron interests with both the iron and banking interests of the Lloyd dynasty and the banking and brewing interest of the Barclay Group. Buxton later became associated with a great insurance firm founded by Samuel Gurney, Alexander Baring, and Sir Moses Montefiore. Buxton's wife, I may add, was the niece of Samuel Hoare Jr., one of the most diligent members of the Abolition Committee. Hoare whose father was a wealthy banker, um, had worked at Henry Gurney's bank in Norwich before entering the London firm that eventually became the core of Barclays Bank. To round matters off, Hoare was related by marriage to the merchant and woolen draper Joseph Woods, who was also in the nucleus of the Abolition Committee. I need not labor the point that Quaker anti-slavery activity was closely associated with the complex ties of intermarriage and with fortunes made from shipping, banking, mining, insurance, and industry. And despite the Quakers' valiant efforts to stay clear of the African slave trade, their quest for profit sometimes compromised their quest for innocence. William Rathbone, one of the few abolitionists in Liverpool, was also one of the city's wealthiest merchants. Although he dealt in timber instead of slaves, his firm was the first in England to receive a consignment of cotton grown in the United States. Such historical ironies were common wherever Quakers took the leadership in the economic revolution. Thus, Moses Brown, the organizer of the Providence Society for abolishing the slave trade and a leader of the anti-slavery movement in New England, supported various philanthropic causes with a fortune made from the West India trade and from the distillation of rum. In 1773, just before his formal conversion to Quakerism, Brown freed his own slaves and began active work against the African trade, hoping to atone for his sin of 8 years before, when he had fitted out a slave ship as a quick way to secure profits for investment in an iron furnace. Yet for all of Brown's attempts to dissociate himself from slavery and to make up for a guilty past, he was the great promoter of early New England cotton manufacturing and the patron of Samuel Slater, whose reconstructed spinning frame prepared the way for the American cotton textile industry. Like their English brethren, the American Quaker abolitionists were distinguished by their mercantile wealth, and above all, they were entrepreneurial by their entrepreneurial leadership. The Pemberton fortune arose from international trade that depended on slave-produced sugar, molasses, rice, and tobacco, as well as on Caribbean markets for North American commodities. But even by the 1750s, the elder Israel Pemberton was discovering that speculation in land, mortgages, and bonds was safer and less time-consuming than investment in commercial shipping. Robert Wallen, that's W-A-L-N, an active abolitionist and a great Philadelphia merchant of the next generation, moved from the China and East India trade to insurance, cotton manufacturing, and iron. Both in his worldly success and in his diversity of his economic and philanthropic interests, Wallen was typical of the Quaker leaders of the Philadelphia and New York abolition societies. There were a number of such influential personages. Among them was Samuel Coates, considered an old-style Philadelphia merchant, a man who was a business correspondent of Moses Brown, a manager of Pennsylvania Hospital, and a director of the First Bank of the United States. Thomas Pym Cope, a promoter of the Chesapeake Delaware Canal, had drawn his wealth from a Philadelphia to Liverpool packet line. Isaac Hicks, a prominent New York banker, was close to the merchant interests represented politically by John Jay. John Murray Sr. was a great New York shipowner and importer whose insurance, banking, and real estate interests, Murray Hill, helped him to accumulate a fortune of $500,000. John Murray Jr., a nephew of the latter and affluent brewer, gave $10,000 in relief to the yellow fever victims of 1798. Thomas Eddy, who moved from Philadelphia to New York after making a fortune in insurance and speculation in the public debt, turned to various public services, becoming a governor of New York Hospital, the chief founder of Newgate Prison, and a promoter of the Bible Society, the Historical Society, the New York Savings Bank, and the Erie Canal. The younger generation of urban Quakers included Jeremiah Thompson, who by 1827 was said to be the largest shipowner in the United States and one of the leading cotton dealers in the world. The Quakers constituted the largest identifiable group in the Philadelphia and New York abolition societies, but it is important to ask what kinds of outsiders they attracted to their pioneering efforts. It would be useful to have a comprehensive and quantitative analysis of the active membership of all the abolition societies. Here I can only venture a few general and preliminary observations. I don't remember where this chapter ends, but I'm going to check real quick to decide whether I need to take a break or not. We do have quite a ways to go. I think I will go ahead and stop there for a minute. I'm going to finish this chapter, but I am going to go get some more water real quick. So I will be back in just a couple minutes. Okay, back to it. Break's over. Get your ass back to reading. All right. So, except in Philadelphia, the major abolition societies represented an extremely narrow and affluent cross section of any given population. The English provincial societies often included artisans, tradesmen, and shopkeepers, many of whom were Quakers or dissenters, along with a striking number of clergymen, a group of conspicuously underrepresented in the American societies except in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Kentucky. Among the more active members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society during its first 20 years of existence, I have identified a saddler, a hatter, a tanner courier, courier, a tailor, a lady's shoemaker, a cooper, three carpenters, probably, two clock and watchmakers, and a number of teachers, booksellers, and printer stationers. Although most of these skilled workers were probably Quakers and may have been relatively well to do, they represent a class that was unseen among the Parisian Amide de Noir, the London Abolition Society, or, with two or three exceptions, among the New York Manumission Society. In any event, the committees of the Pennsylvania Society were clearly dominated by merchants, lawyers, doctors, and the holders of high public office. Because the society was oriented toward enforcement of the emancipation law in a city close to neighboring slaveholding states, it retained a large legal council and counted among its members an unusually high proportion of attorneys. A study of 49 of the more active New York abolitionists shows that at least 23 were merchants and shipowners. 8 were bankers, including several bank presidents and directors. 8 were lawyers and judges. The remaining number included a few ministers, doctors, and college professors, along with a scattered assortment of canal promoters, land speculators, and the owners of drug firms, dry goods stores, sawmills, and boarding houses. Although the overwhelming majority of Americans were farmers, the abolition societies contained virtually no members with agricultural interests, unless one counts those involved in speculation in confiscated Tory estates and western lands. General, general. German, Dutch, and French names were conspicuously scarce in the membership rosters. The New York Society included, at least nominally, the high command of the Federalist Party: Hamilton J., Colonel Robert Troup, General Matthew Clarkson, John B. Murray, and many others. But neither the New York nor Pennsylvania societies was a Federalist club. They contained prominent anti-Federalists, Clintonian and Jeffersonian Democrats, former Liberty Boys, and the sons of Tory families. The striking point is not party affiliation, but the number of active abolitionists who held important offices. Among the members of both societies were United States senators, congressmen, federal judges, and diplomats. Federal and state attorneys general, members of state legislatures, of constitutional conventions, and of city councils. The abolition societies were, in short, one of the municipal meeting grounds for men of wealth, influence, and political power. During the post-revolutionary decades, American municipal life was invigorated by a movement for cooperative organization in the public interest. This spirit partly reflected the commercial and philanthropic ideals of the European Enlightenment, which had led to similar planning and civic organization in cities like Edinburgh. In America, however, there were special circumstances that quickened the sense of local responsibility. Political independence forced merchants to find new markets and routes of trade, while simultaneously opening new opportunities in business, banking, and manufacturing. Interurban rivalry spurred local leaders to improve transportation facilities and to found by various charters and acts of incorporation institutions for public service. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society was officially incorporated in 1789. In both Philadelphia and New York, the abolition societies were thus parts of an interlocking network of public and private organizations designed to give order and direction to municipal life. In both cities, the leading abolitionists could also be found in the chambers of commerce and in companies promoting canals and improved inland navigation, on the boards of savings banks, libraries, hospitals, Bible societies, and Sunday school societies, as commissioners and directors of almshouses, poorhouses, and prisons. The London abolitionists exhibited a similar profile except for the affiliation of many non-Quakers with the evangelical movement. In one sense, these interlocking directorates can be taken as evidence of the civic pride and philanthropic spirit of successful men who met in the same social clubs and in the same banks and exchanges, and who shared a common interest in the in the collective health and welfare of their fellow townsmen. Their concern for the Negro cannot be dismissed as a substitute for broader social concerns. The members of the abolition societies worked to extend and improve the education of the poor, to help imprisoned debtors, to provide free smallpox vaccination for the indigent, and to give information and assistance to newly arrived immigrants. And unlike the London and Parisian abolitionists, the reformers of New York and Philadelphia were an unrivaled elite, free from the restraints of an established aristocracy and from the fear of what Jefferson termed the canaille. Canaille? Canaille? It's Canaille. Double L, I'm assuming, is the yeah, the it's not an L sound. Anyway, um, there was something a second ago. The They mentioned imprisoned debtors. I heard somebody recently proposing that we bring back debtors' prisons. It's an interesting idea. Not sure I agree, but it's an interesting idea. On the other hand, by the 1790s, America's two largest cities were hardly immune from labor conflict. Immigration from Europe was on the rise. The old apprenticeship system continued to decay, and skilled artisans and mechanics complained of cheapened standards and of unfair competition from poorly trained and underpaid workers. In the face of unemployment and a growing pool of cheap labor, some skilled workers saw the manumission of slaves as a further threat to their former dignity and independence. There is no reason to suspect that the entrepreneurial abolitionists were conspiring to lower wages by increasing the free labor force or by preventing the southward drain of Negroes. They were concerned, however, with the broader question of labor discipline and with devising efficient institutions to replace older methods of social control. For example, in both Philadelphia and New York, they helped to create the modern prison system, dedicated to the rehabilitation of deviants by means of steady work, habit shaping regimen, and strict control over all aspects of life. Instead of being whipped and branded and then set free with an unchanged heart, the offender would now be placed behind walls, ostensibly for his own good as well as that of society, and transformed into a dependable and willing worker. Most of the philanthropies linked with the abolition cause had two broad aims: to protect an urban population from disease and disorder, thereby ensuring the smooth functioning for the social and economic system, and to inculcate the lower classes with various moral and economic virtues so that workers would want to do what the emerging economy required. Slavery seemed entirely antithetical to this public-spirited ideology. Like sanguinary punishments, it seemed to be a relic of the barbarous past, and if slaves could be converted into sober, self-disciplined workers, the same could presumably be done with vagabonds, whores, felons, and deviants of every kind. The point to be stressed is that the Quaker example included considerably more than a decision to manumit their slaves. Both in England and in the northern states, the Quakers worked tirelessly for improved credit and insurance facilities, for canal systems and better roads, for transatlantic mail packets, for chambers of commerce, and ultimately for railroads. And they linked such quote unquote useful improvements with a variety of civic and philanthropic projects, for in the Quaker worldview there were no disparities between business enterprise and devoting one's leisure time to the dissemination of Bibles, to the promotion of science, to the building of hospitals and prisons, and to the eradication of slavery. God's plan for human progress revealed through reason and natural law was all of a piece. The canals, banks, and technological improvements would be of little use unless workers understood the dynamic core of the Quaker ethic, responsibility. It was not by chance that Franklin issued his famed homilies from the Quaker city. William Allen and the limitations of Quaker philanthropy. William Allen, a key figure in the British anti-slavery movement, epitomizes the meaning of Quaker science and philanthropy in the face of revolutionary change. I have already mentioned that Rebecca Jones, the missionary from Philadelphia, imbued young Allen with the spirit of the evangelical revival. Much earlier, Allen had developed a keen interest in chemistry and astronomy, and at 14 had built his own telescope. At 18, however, Allen's mind became absorbed with religious introspection and with a daily struggle recorded in his spiritual diary against self-indulgence. At that time, in 1788, his models of Quaker piety included Rebecca Jones, George Dillwyn, and John Pemberton. He was deeply moved by Pemberton's account of Quaker committees visiting and helping Negroes in Philadelphia. As a symbol of his own quest for purity, Allen resolved to abstain from sugar until its West Indian cultivators had been emancipated, a vow he kept for 43 years. It happened that Allen was born and grew up in one of the first parts of London to feel the more devastating effects of the economic revolution. His father had moved from Scrooby, the home of Plymouth Pilgrims, to become a silk manufacturer in Spitalfields, which was a long tradition in E.P. Thompson's words of, quote, anti-authoritarian turbulence, end quote. According to Thompson, the Spitalfields silk weavers were the first, quote, large group of domestic workers whose conditions anticipate those of the semi-employed proletarian outworkers of the 19th century, end quote. As a result of exploitive innovations in management and of increasing competition from Lancashire cottons, the Spitalfields silk weavers were degraded to a ghastly level of poverty and overcrowding. In short, young Allen lived in the midst of a noxious ghetto which threatened at any moment to explode into violence. Much to his father's disappointment, he left the family silk mill at the age of 22 and began working at Plough Court for Joseph Gurney Bevan. By 1786, he was on the Slave Trade Committee of the London Meeting for Sufferings. He married a Hanbury of the tin plate industry and soon became proprietor of Bevan's pharmaceutical concern, which ultimately became Allen and Hanbury's. Hanbury's. I don't know why I was mispronouncing that. It might be tempting to conclude that Allen's anti-slavery activities were a hypocritical effort to divert attention from the sufferings of English working men. Thompson, for example, quotes a remarkable address to the public from an anonymous Manchester journeyman, cotton spinner, who seemed to suspect that humanitarians had contrived a double standard for judging the condition of English workers and West Indian slaves. English workers supposedly enjoyed the equal protection of law and were free to leave their places of employment. Yet, quote, the Negro slave in the West Indies, if he works under a scorching sun, has probably a little breeze of air sometimes to fan him. He has a space of ground and a time allowed to cultivate it. The English spinner slave has no enjoyment of the open atmosphere and breezes of heaven. Locked up in factories 8 stories high, he has no relaxation till the ponderous engine stops, and then he goes home to get refreshed for the next day. No time for sweet association with his family. They are all alike fatigued and exhausted. End quote. The difficulty is that William Allen was fully aware of the human misery in Spitalfields and of the later degradation of English mill workers. As a rich entrepreneur who had close ties with evangelicals like William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton, he would probably have endorsed the first part of Burke's famous message of 1795 to the starving poor. Quote, patience, labor, sobriety, frugality, and religion should be recommended to them. All the rest is downright fraud. End quote. But Allen was also heir to the Quaker variant of dissent, which, for all its inward turning spirituality and its dilution by wealth, still contained both a latent dissatisfaction with the social order and the vision of a more harmonious and equalitarian world. Beginning in 1797, he helped to organize a committee to distribute soup to the ragged masses of Spitalfields. By 1812, he reorganized Soup Society. His reorganized Soup Society was conducting street-by-street surveys of the area, recording data on population, age, literacy, religion, and families without Bibles. Allen may have considered the possession of a Bible as important as the possession of a job, and the doles of soup as an antidote to revolution. The fact remains that Allen's journal, The Philanthropist, designed to stimulate quote-unquote virtue and active benevolence, combined information on West Indian and American slavery with detailed reports on the plight of the English poor. Except for limitations of time and energy, there is no inherent reason that a concern for one species of injustice should blind a man to other species of injustice. Indeed, Allen probably weakened his effectiveness by engaging in such an incredible number of benevolent activities, and his passion for philanthropy was partly a way of justifying his active hobby of science. As a student of science, Allen faced a growing conflict between his faith in God's intelligible design and his fear of French and German natural philosophy. Later in life, while writing a paper for the Royal Society on the respiration of pigeons, he threatened Henry Brougham that he would withdraw his sponsorship from the Library of Useful Knowledge unless Kant's works were suppressed. A friend of Sir Humphrey Davy, Allen gave popular lectures to the Royal Institution, helped write a notable paper on carbonic acid, and was elected Fellow of the Linnean and Royal Societies. He was confident that, quote, the pursuits of science properly conducted tend to enlarge our views, to banish narrow prejudices, to increase our love of truth and order, and give tone and vigor to the mind, end quote. Nevertheless, throughout his life, Allen kept reminding himself, quote, beware lest chemistry and natural philosophy usurp the highest seat in thy heart, end quote. Discovery of truth in natural science only, quote, exalted the creature, whereas spiritual truths always lays him low, end quote. It was actually two short quotes. In 1812, Allen comforted himself by the thought that his main object had been the good of others. Quote, "For if indeed of these things my time were devoted to philosophical pursuits and experiments to which I am so naturally prone, the path to honor and distinction stands far above me. May the sacrifice be accepted above." End quote. These inner conflicts provide insight into the goals Allen sought in philanthropy. Social reform, though secular by traditional standards, was a spiritual outlet that balanced worldly success in business and science. It also furnished an inner test of moral worthiness. Allen hoped that his efforts to do good did not spring merely from, quote, benevolent intentions, end quote, but also from the humble sense that he was an instrument in the hand of the Lord. Above all, reform led to acceptable eternal ties with the non-Quaker world. An analysis of the nature and limitations of such external ties will help illuminate the subtle connections between class ideology and the Quaker evangelical faith. The early Quaker revivalists foreshadowed the moralistic concerns of the great evangelical awakening of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The evangelical crusade within the Church of England, the triumphs of Methodism on both sides of the Atlantic, and parallel movements within the Baptist and Presbyterian churches. Apart from important theological differences, the Quaker itinerants called for the moral uplift of the common people, inveighing against drunkenness, sexual immorality, ignorance of religion, and desecration of the Sabbath. If the Quaker ethic could lead to more radical and secular critiques of the social order, and one may cite Thomas Paine as a witness, the Quaker evangelicals were as horrified by Paine and by the French Revolution as were Wilberforce and Hannah More. Like the evangelicals within the Church of England, their program for reforming the nation's morals had two goals: to produce a sober, self-disciplined, and industrious working population, and to persuade the upper classes to devote their time and wealth to ennobling causes rather than to gay parties, gambling, and other conspicuous forms of waste and self-indulgence. The result of such reforms, even if not uppermost in the reformer's mind, would be a society free from the threat of class conflict and revolution. This ideology had considerable appeal for the young Quakers of Allen's generation. Born into an affluent environment but surrounded by the boredom and erosion of wealth, Allen's friends Elizabeth Gurney frankly confessed that she had been leading a frivolous and un-Quaker social life before her conversion to serious religion. To families like the Gurneys, Barclays, and Hoares, wealth had brought a slackening of Quaker discipline, exogamous marriage, and a drift away from a religious identity. But paradoxically, the same communication network that helped to create the toxin of wealth also accelerated the movement for self-purification. A further paradox was that the Quaker revival, while restoring a sense of religious identity and purpose, also brought Quakers into cooperative alliance with outsiders, most notably with the Wilberforce Thornton Syndicate of Reformers. In a sense, it was this later group that appropriated Quaker programs and Quaker modes of organization as a means of reforming and saving the nation. But for Quakers both in Britain and America, membership in non-denominational societies provided a means of confirming economic success with social acceptability. When a man like Allen collaborated with the British ruling elite in the African Institution, the British and Foreign Bible Society, and the British and Foreign School Society, he became at least a halfway member of the moral establishment, and he assimilated many of its values. The great benevolent societies helped to shape a consciousness of class identity and purpose, and when leading merchants, bankers, and manufacturers met together in reform societies, they were not unmindful of useful contacts for business purposes. I think we're about 5 pages from the end here. On the other hand, such alliances could not altogether surmount religious prejudice. Granville Sharp once remarked that Anthony Benezet, his anti slavery correspondent, was, quote, unhappily involved in the errors of Quakerism, end quote. Wilberforce bluntly wrote Allen that he wished, quote, for your own sake and that of the world, that your religious principles and my own were more entirely accordant, end quote. Allen's Quaker friend Richard Reynolds commented bitterly on such condescension after all that Quakers had done for the Bible Society and to secure Wilberforce's election in Yorkshire. Raymond's would hope, quote, that class to which he, Thornton, and Stephen belonged should be convinced that we are, as we are willing to admit that they may be, real genuine Christians, end quote. Yet for Wilberforce and his associates, the interests of true Christianity took precedent over any benevolent cause, and nonconformists like Allen could only be looked upon pathetically as poor creatures, quote unquote. If Allen's ties with liberal reformers were limited, they also qualify any conclusion that he was solely interested in preserving the social order through moral regeneration. Whereas Hannah More's Sunday schools were intended to produce a dutiful and tractable working population whose education would stop with religious indoctrination, Allen was genuinely dedicated to the cause of educating the public. Despite their close cooperation in the anti-slavery cause, Wilberforce declined Allen's invitation to join the committee of subscribers to the Lancasterian Society, an organization that included such utilitarian associates of Allen's as James Mill and David Ricardo. Allen was undisturbed by the democratic implications of the Lancasterian system, which was intended to multiply the effectiveness of knowledge by converting pupils into participating teachers. Unlike the evangelical leaders, Charles Simeon, Allen did not think that the movement to reform the penal code was unsuitable for religious people, so long as a rationalist like Samuel Romilly led the cause. Allen also campaigned against capital punishment, exchanging information with American Quaker philanthropists like John Murray Jr., as well as with European monarchs. But Allen's most revealing involvement with secular reform came from the encouragement of Robert Owen's paternalistic experiments at New Lanark. In Allen's eyes, Owen's experiments promised to solve the otherwise catastrophic problems of industrialism. He therefore furnished substantial funds that helped Owen take over the mill town and carry out his reforms. As one of the proprietors of New Lanark, Allen was delighted by the unmistakable improvements in working and social conditions. The rupture came, not the rapture. The rapture didn't come. The rupture came when it began to dawn on the devout Quaker that Owen was, quote, a determined enemy, end quote, of all revealed religion. Indeed, at New Lanark, Owen seemed bent on proving that human happiness required emancipation from the belief in the divinity of the Bible. Quote, we came into the concern, end quote, no, not end quote. We came into the concern, Allen wrote Owen in 1815, not to form a manufactory of infidels, but to support a benevolent character and plans of a very different nature in which the happiness of millions and the cause of morality and virtue are deeply concerned." End quote. Together with Joseph Fox, Allen forced Owen to introduce the Bible in New Lanark schools. He himself lectured the workers on the importance of revealed religion. Allen perfectly trusted the Russian emperor's professions of humanitarianism and his promises to promote public education, presumably in line with Quaker principles, while in contrast, Allen threatened to withdraw from New Lanark unless Owen surrendered all control over educating the children, who had proved to be deficient in spiritual knowledge. It was precisely because the eyes of the enlightened world were fastened upon New Lanark that Allen resolved to do anything in his power, even if it meant removing Owen as manager, to prevent the model town from becoming, quote, "an infidel establishment," end quote. The more contact Allen had with the secular radicalism, the more importance he attached to religious orthodoxy. Among the sound causes that increasingly absorbed his energies were the dissemination of Bibles and anti-slavery doctrine. Whew. We're almost there, I think. A preliminary assessment, the symbolism of slave and free labor. Quaker testimony against slavery was an extension of the sect's traditional stand against war and violence. Such testimony also served in time of crisis and persecution, both as a test of purity and as an emblem of distinctive identity. But the early Quaker revival, which spawned collective efforts to rid the Society of Friends of Slaveholding, issued a broader challenge to the ethical basis of capital accumulation. Unlike their anti-slavery disciples and successors, Woolman and Benezet were content to live in the most humble circumstances. Benezet, whom wealthy friends described as extremely unprepossessing, unprepossessing in appearance, expressed skepticism over the cant, that's in quotes, cant, C-A-N-T, he heard about the stewardship of wealth. Writing to Samuel Fothergill in 1755, he questioned the rationalizations by which Quaker capitalists justified their success. And we have a very long quote here. Better water up first. Quote, "And there are some who, though they have already a large affluence of wealth, yet are toiling hard to add thereto, without knowing wherefore they thus toil, and whether a wise man or a fool shall possess it after them. Why do so many suffer the God of this world so to blind their eyes and vitiate their reasonable as well as religious senses, as to suffer them to toil after gain, and think it is a mighty thing, and themselves notably employed, if they can add £1,000 to £1,000, or £10,000 to £10,000, and that often by a trade far from being pure from defilement, as such gain often arises chiefly from the purchase and sale of things at least needless and vain, if not of a defiling nature, an instance of which I have often painfully observed amongst us, where it is frequent to see even friends toiling year after year, enriching themselves, and thus gathering fuel for their own and their children's vanity and corruption by the importation and sale of large quantities of rum, etc. Now that such a person shall esteem himself and be esteemed a religious man, and perhaps be the most regarded even by religious people, which, because he is rich and great, is a mere paradox. Yet is it too often the case, shall we desire to be great and rich, when our Savior has so plainly declared it a situation so very dangerous, and that his predominant choice is of the poor of this world?" End quote. Okay. Such words warning against the allure of security and accommodation echo the spirit of 17th century religious radicalism, insofar as Benezet's critique represented the spirit of the Quaker revival. The revival itself struck at the heart of the business ethic that was enriching families like the Pembertons, Hoares, Gurneys, and Barclays, on whose consciences the revival had a profound impact. From the Benezets, Fothergills, and Churchmans, the wealthy Friends acquired their zeal for education, temperance, and anti-slavery. They showed little inclination, however, of abandoning their ideology of progress, which justified toiling hard, quote, to add £10,000 to £10,000, end quote. No one should expect the Quaker capitalists to have renounced their wealth, and the possession of wealth does not cast doubt on the moral sincerity of Quaker abolitionists. They were, after all, a pioneering minority who were among the first modern capitalists to recognize both the social responsibilities of wealth and the social consequences of economic action. Yet it is essential to distinguish individual motive from the larger ideological functions of a movement like anti-slavery. The Society of Friends interpreted each step toward a total disengagement from slaveholding as a tangible sign of growing religious purity. For men disturbed by the revival's strictures against wealth, anti-slavery suggested the compromise of limited sacrifice, though obviously a sacrifice of keener anguish for a few Quaker planters in the South. Abolitionist activity allowed many of Benezet's, quote, rich and great Quakers to be esteemed, end quote, religious men, and in accordance with moral criteria which Benezet himself had helped establish. It also brought them into contact with the rich and great of other denominations, enabling them to escape some of the exclusiveness and inwardness of their sect. To moralists and reformers of other faiths, the Quakers demonstrated that testimony against slavery could be a social correlative of inner purity which seemed to pose no threat to the social order, at least to that capitalist order in which the Quakers had won so enviable a stake. As a social force, anti-slavery was a highly selective response to labor exploitation. It provided an outlet for demonstrating a Christian concern for human suffering and injustice, and yet thereby gave a certain moral insulation to economic activities less visibly dependent on human suffering and injustice. Viewed from one perspective, the Quakers were at the headwaters of a widening stream of philanthropy and social reform. From another viewpoint, they created the liberal tradition of being kind to Negroes as proof of one's humanitarianism. The simplistic thesis that Quaker abolitionists were concerned by economic interest, quote unquote, in the sense that they stood to profit from the destruction of the slave trade or a weakening of the plantation system, cannot bear examination. But Negro slavery was a system of labor which raised fundamental questions about the meaning of freedom, dependability, and discipline. The Quaker reformers represented an entrepreneurial class which confronted, at least in Great Britain, an unruly labor force, much of it recently uprooted from village or rural life. A labor force which even in the early 19th century had not yet been disciplined to the factory system, and which expressed its frustrations in riots, crime, sabotage, and other acts of uninhibited violence. Okay, just scrolling ahead here to see how far we have. The Quakers engaged in the anti-slavery cause were also deeply concerned over domestic problems of labor discipline. William Dillwyn, for example, praised Quaker manufacturers for being more attentive to the welfare of the children in their mills and for being careful, quote, to preserve good order among them and employ a man to instruct them in reading, etc., during certain hours for which no deduction is made from their wages, end quote. The wider adoption of such practices, Dillwyn thought, would reduce the public complaints that factories were nurseries of vice. David Barclay circulated large broadsheets giving, quote, advice to servants, end quote, some of which echoed the sermons of American slaveholders. Quote, be not what is called an eye servant, appearing diligent in sight but neglectful when out of it, end quote. Oh, followed by yet several other distinct quotes. Quote, avoid pert answers, for civil language is cheap and impertinence provoking, end quote. Quote, never stay when sent on a message. Waiting long is painful to a master, and a quick return shows diligence, end quote. Barclay's central message, however, was that a good character, quote unquote, should be the supreme goal of servants, quote, for it is their bread, end quote. Therefore, servants should watch the company they keep and never provoke their superiors. As for their freedom to change employers, quote, the servant that often changes his place works only to be poor, end quote. Consider also the following specimen. On July 15, 1787, Dr. John Coakley Lettsom wrote Dr. Benjamin Rush on the subjects of prisons and slavery. Rush, who read Lettsom's letter on the Philadelphia Prison Society, had become convinced that, quote, a person sometimes supplies the place of a church and out-preaches the preacher in conveying useful instruction to the heart, end quote. Lettsom reported that villainy was accumulating so fast in England that necessity would soon cure the prejudice against prisons. He had himself favored condemning convicts to public labor out of doors, assuming that the beneficial example to spectators would be more permanent than that of the gallows. Lettsom was struck, however, by Rush's argument that the example might serve to render any physical labor ignominious. On the other hand, he cited an instance of convicts who were chained at night on a ship and who worked on the land in day. Although voluntary laborers performed the same drudgery within sight of the convicts, the proximity enhanced their appreciation of their own liberty. Quote, for however the body may be occupied alike, the mind is impressed very differently as voluntary labor and condemned slavery can impress the mind, end quote. Hence, quote, the example of the latter may be beneficial to the morality of the community without entailing disgrace upon any species of voluntary industry, end quote. Without cause, Lettsom then proceeded to express his joy over the joint British and American efforts to abolish the slave trade. What distinguished the Quakers from earlier mercantilist writers who had also pondered schemes for suppressing villainy and for putting the unruly poor to work was the Quakers' gift for assimilating utility and national interest to a humanitarian ethic. The Quakers, unlike the mercantilists, deplored visible or overt forms of social cruelty, such as the slave trade, but they also helped to create a moral climate in which a highly ethical purpose could disguise the effects of power. Although 18th century Quakers were not responsible for the consequences of a 19th century free labor market or for the consequences of British efforts to stamp out the slave trade in the heart of Africa, they unwittingly drew distinctions and boundaries which opened the way under a guise of moral rectitude for unprecedented forms of oppression. Clearly, for Rush and Lettsom, there was no comparability between condemned slavery, quote unquote, and Negro slavery, except for the possibility that both might render voluntary labor ignominious. For Barclay, it was inconceivable that English servants were in any sense unfree. For Dilwyn, the children in the English mines and factories were the beneficiaries of wholesome discipline, except where the factories had become nurseries of vice. The children of American slaves, who seldom endured such regular work or supervision, were the victims of unquestioned oppression. Despite what we have said concerning William Allen's Soup Society and educational reforms, anti-slavery ideology served to isolate specific forms of human misery, allowing issues of freedom and discipline to be faced in a relatively simplified model. And by defining slavery as a unique moral aberration, the ideology tended to give sanction to the prevailing economic order. If we look at on anti-slavery as a game certain people played, which as a conceptual device implies no lack of seriousness on the player's parts, but simply points to the definition of the acceptance of arbitrary rules, then we can appreciate how the movement helped to reshape attitudes toward work, liberty, exploitation, and proper discipline. What made the Negro slave ideally suited as a counter in such a game was his lack of responsibility for his own status. By definition, he was innocent of the burdens and coercions of the Protestant work ethic, almost as if his forced labor had freed him from the unhappy legacy of Adam's curse. Accordingly, Quakers and others could commiserate with his sufferings and attack his exploiters while reaffirming both the validity of economic law and God's wisdom in assigning men equal stations in life. Yet there can be no greater disparity of power than that between a man convinced of his own disinterested service and another man who is defined as a helpless object. As representatives of the emerging capitalist order, extending charity to the lowliest segment of laborers, Quaker reformers could not view Negroes as even potentially autonomous beings. Most of the Negroes freed by Quaker masters were quietly dissuaded from trying to join the Society of Friends. Liberation from slavery did not mean freedom to live as one chose, but rather freedom to become a diligent, sober, dependable worker who gratefully accepted his position in society. Freedom required the internalization of moral precepts in the place of less subtle forms of external coercion. No doubt it was a sign of progressive enlightenment when Moses Brown showed concern over providing secure savings deposits for his freed slaves. William Allen promoted the same idea for the workers of New Lanark. Yet neither man doubted that he knew the best interests of the laboring class or that saving from wages was an act of freedom. The end, and that is the end of that chapter, finally. Okay, so I'm just looking ahead. That puts us at chapter 6 for next time. There are 11 chapters total. The next one is actually a little shorter yet. It's shorter than the one we just read. So it'll be a little bit easier to get through in one reading. Might even be able to do it without taking a break. But that is that for tonight. My voice is done. My interest in being online is done. And nobody oh, wait, no, oh. Let me see. We've got Hot Dog Raw Dog is still on. Yeah, he'll be on for a while. So I'm going to go ahead and take us on over there to raid. So please bear with us for a minute or two. We'll go on over and yeah, give him a minute of his time, of your time. So here we go. See you there.
like that stuff. I wish it only showed me like who my friends with on there or something like it used to be. All right, here, send me an invite.
All right, I'll send you guys invites so that you're. There we go. Thank you so much for the. Hang on a second. Thank you so much for the raid, Mr. Meneth Gilgalad. All right, let me give you a shout out. How are you? How was your stream? That is awesome. Thank you so much for the raid. Right. Oh, just chatting. Were you doing one of your occult readings? You know, your occult readings are like really good, really fascinating. Right, there we go. Well, give me 1 second here. I sent invites to you guys, so hang on. Let me.
Yeah, I'm there.
Well, if you're not following Meneth Gilgalad already, please give him a follow. He's a
I didn't
fantastical
get an invite.
streamer, a fantastical human being, and
Where's the SpongeBob one?
a variety streamer. He does. He plays a wide variety of games. He has the. He also does his occult readings, which are fantastical. So please give him a follow. Go over, show him some love. He's a fantastical streamer. It was a good stream. I'm reading a book called the. Is that the same one you were reading